Mason Carter reached the gate with 12 minutes to spare when the agent scanned his boarding pass a second time. "Sir, you are not getting on this aircraft." Everyone turned. Mason asked why, but the supervisor only said his name had triggered a restriction. Across the terminal, Charlotte Hayes watched in silence, recognizing Mason from a confidential file she had received that morning. Military boots struck the floor behind them. An Air Force colonel walked through the gate, looked at Mason and stopped. "Who denied this man boarding?" he demanded. Mason's expression changed. The colonel knew exactly who he was. Stay with Mason, because what that colonel reveals will slowly expose a secret someone desperately tried to bury for years. Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was already loud with morning traffic when Mason Carter walked toward his gate, a small travel bag over one shoulder and a laptop case in hand. He had a flight to catch to Colorado Springs, a technical review that had taken weeks to schedule, and a text message from his daughter still glowing faintly on his phone. "Good luck today, Dad." He read it twice, smiled the way tired parents smile at small kindnesses, and slid the phone into his jacket pocket. There was no crisis in his morning yet. There was only coffee, boarding time, and the ordinary hum of people moving toward destinations they barely thought about twice. He reached the gate with 12 minutes to spare, joining the short line forming near the counter. The agent took his boarding pass, scanned it, and paused. She scanned it again. A small red light blinked on her screen, and her posture changed in the way people's postures change when a system tells them something they do not want to say out loud. She called for her supervisor without explanation, and within moments Catherine Blake arrived, studied the same screen, and felt her stomach tighten. Catherine had worked airport operations long enough to know the difference between a glitch and a flag. This was not a glitch. She looked up at Mason, a man in his 40s with quiet eyes, and the kind of stillness that came from years of not needing to prove anything to strangers, and she delivered the words she had been trained to deliver without elaboration. "Mr. Carter, I'm afraid you cannot board this flight." Mason asked why calmly, the way a man asks a question he expects to have a simple answer. Catherine's jaw tightened. She was only permitted to offer 2 words, and she offered them without meeting his eyes for long security restriction. Mason asked what kind of restriction, what agency had issued it, what it referred to specifically. Catherine did not know. The system did not tell her that. It only told her to refuse boarding and log the refusal. Around them, the gate area had gone quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it senses trouble without understanding it. A man near the window pulled his suitcase an inch closer to his own leg, an unconscious gesture of distance. A woman glanced at Mason, then away, then back again, as if trying to place a face she had never actually seen before. Nobody said anything cruel. Nobody needed to. The silence did the work on its own, turning an ordinary passenger into something the room had quietly decided to be wary of. Mason handed over his identification without protest, offered his frequent traveler records, and asked them to check the system again. Everything came back valid. His identity was not in question. The restriction itself was the mystery, sitting on the screen like an accusation with no author. And there was one detail that troubled him more than the refusal itself. He had checked in less than an hour earlier without incident. Whatever had triggered this warning had been added afterward quietly while he stood in line for coffee. A few rows away, a woman in a tailored coat lowered the report she had been reading and looked up. Charlotte Hayes had boarded early and taken a seat near enough to watch the gate without appearing to watch it. She had not planned to notice Mason Carter specifically, but his name caught her attention the moment Catherine said it aloud. That morning, before leaving her hotel, Charlotte had received a confidential compliance memo referencing an external reviewer scheduled to examine a batch of components manufactured by her own company. The name on that memo had been Mason Carter, and now that same man was being denied boarding in front of her for reasons nobody in the gate area seemed able to explain. Charlotte did not move yet. She watched, turning the coincidence over in her mind, aware that coincidences involving her company's compliance reviews rarely stayed coincidences for long. Catherine reached for her radio to call additional security, a routine step when a passenger refused to leave the boarding area quietly, though Mason had not raised his voice or resisted in any way. Before she could speak into it, the sound of boots against tile cut through the terminal, steady and unhurried, the particular rhythm of someone used to walking through rooms that went silent around him. Passengers turned. An Air Force colonel in uniform moved through the gate area with 2 junior officers a step behind him, clearly headed toward a different flight entirely. Then he saw Mason and he stopped. For a moment neither man spoke. The colonel's eyes moved from Mason's face to the boarding pass still in Catherine's hand, and something in his expression sharpened into focus. He stepped past the line without asking permission, close enough now that Catherine straightened instinctively. "Who denied this man boarding?" he asked, and his voice was not loud, but it filled the space anyway, the way certain voices do when they are used to being answered. Catherine hesitated. Charlotte rose from her seat. Around the gate, the ordinary rhythm of the terminal seemed to slow without actually stopping, the way a room narrows its attention without anyone deciding to look away. Announcements continued overhead for flights that had nothing to do with any of this. Luggage wheels rattled somewhere behind them, and a child 2 rows over asked her father why the man by the counter looked so calm when everyone else looked worried. Mason had heard some version of that question before, in different rooms, at different points in his life, and it had never stopped being strange to him that composure could read as suspicious to people who had never needed it themselves. He was not thinking about vindication in that moment. He was thinking about the meeting waiting for him in Colorado Springs, about the module sitting untouched on a bench 1,100 miles away, and about how every minute spent standing at this gate was a minute someone, somewhere, had almost certainly planned for him to lose. The colonel did not demand that the gate be reopened or that rules be broken on his authority. That was not how Jackson Reed operated, and it was not how the situation would be solved. Instead, he asked Catherine a direct question. What category of restriction was showing on the system, and who had entered it? Catherine explained carefully that the flag required secondary verification before boarding could proceed, and that the request had originated outside her own department. Jackson listened, and something in his expression told anyone watching that he already suspected the answer was wrong before she finished speaking. Whispers moved through the small crowd still lingering near the gate. Jackson turned to Mason, and for a moment the years between them seemed to fold away entirely. "It has been a long time," he said. 7 years, Mason answered. Charlotte, standing close enough now to hear the exchange, realized quickly that whatever history existed between these two men, it was not a military one on Mason's side. He was not an officer, he never had been. But he had clearly mattered to Jackson Reed in some capacity significant enough that a colonel would stop mid-stride in a crowded terminal. Jackson explained, briefly and without exaggeration, for Catherine's benefit as much as the surrounding passengers. Mason had once served as a civilian engineer attached to a reliability assessment program, evaluating aircraft systems that multiple internal teams had already cleared. He had found an error others missed, a flaw quiet enough to pass every existing check, and the correction that followed had prevented a serious failure down the line. Jackson did not call him a hero. He did not need to. He simply said that if a man with that history was suddenly being flagged by an unrelated system, the flag deserved verification before anything else happened. It was a careful distinction, and an important one. A colonel could not simply order a commercial airline to seat a passenger. What he could do was insist that a suspicious restriction be examined rather than blindly obeyed, and that insistence alone was enough to shift the entire tone of the gate. Charlotte stepped forward at last, closing the distance between herself and the two men. "Mason Carter," she said, not quite a question. He turned toward her, taking in the tailored coat, the composed posture, the quiet authority of someone used to walking into rooms that already knew who she was. "Charlotte Hayes," she answered. The name landed immediately. Hayes Aeronautics, the company whose components Mason had been flying to Colorado Springs to examine. The company whose confidential compliance memo had only hours earlier listed his name as the external reviewer assigned to a batch of parts drawing internal concern. The air around the gate seemed to shift again, quieter this time, heavier. Mason studied her for a moment before speaking. "Who knew I was flying today?" he asked. Charlotte did not answer right away. The question was smaller than it sounded and far more dangerous. Inside Hayes Aeronautics, the list of people aware of the reviewer's travel schedule was short by design. Charlotte herself, the compliance director, legal counsel, and the company's chief operating officer, Logan Pierce. Catherine, still holding the tablet that displayed the restriction, pulled up the timestamp attached to the flag and read it aloud without being asked. 6:48 in the morning. Mason had checked in at 6:11. The restriction had appeared 32 minutes later quietly, while he stood in line for coffee believing his morning was uneventful. Someone had not wanted Mason Carter on that plane, and they had acted with precision rather than panic, which was somehow more unsettling than if they had panicked at all. Charlotte's phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down and felt something cold settle in her chest. The message was from Logan Pierce. Heard your consultant had trouble at the airport, maybe postpone the review. Charlotte had told no one that Mason had been detained. She had not called Logan. She had not messaged anyone at all since arriving at the gate, which meant Logan already knew. Charlotte slid the phone back into her pocket without answering Logan's message and without letting her expression show what she had just realized. She was not ready to let him know that she suspected anything, not yet, not until she understood how deep the problem actually ran. She turned to Mason instead, lowering her voice so the words stayed between them. "If you don't make it to Colorado Springs today, what happens?" she asked. Mason explained without embellishment. The review concerned a set of flight control power modules manufactured by Hayes Aeronautics, 3 units that had produced abnormal thermal readings during testing. The company's internal report attributed the anomaly to sensor error, a simple explanation that closed the file quickly and kept production moving. Mason had not agreed with that conclusion when he first reviewed the data remotely, and the only way to settle the question properly was to examine one of the removed modules in person, on the test bench in Colorado, where the physical evidence could not be summarized away. He needed to be there today. If the review slipped by even 48 hours, another batch of the same component line would clear approval and ship without the questions Mason intended to raise ever being answered. Charlotte absorbed this in silence. Whoever had blocked Mason's flight did not need to harm him. They only needed to delay him long enough for a decision to be made without his input, and delay was so much easier to justify than anything more direct. Colonel Reed, still nearby, made one measured call to confirm that Mason's name appeared on no restricted list connected to his prior defense work, closing off that particular avenue entirely. Catherine, working through her own contacts, escalated the flagged restriction to airport security for a formal review of its origin. Both efforts confirmed the same conclusion. The flag had been irregular, likely unauthorized, and worth investigating further. None of it mattered in the moment that counted. Through the gate's window, Mason watched his original flight begin its slow pushback from the jet bridge, engines already spinning toward departure. Whoever had wanted him grounded that morning had gotten exactly what they wanted, at least for now. "They got what they came for," he said quietly. "Not necessarily," Charlotte answered. She explained that her company kept a private aircraft at Boeing Field, and that she herself needed to be in Colorado Springs later that day for an unrelated meeting. The timing, inconvenient an hour earlier, had suddenly become useful. She offered him a seat without hesitation. Mason studied her for a long moment before responding. He had just begun to suspect that someone inside her own company might be working against the very review he was flying to conduct, and flying alongside the chief executive of that company carried its own risk. "Then you probably shouldn't let me out of your sight," Charlotte said before he could voice the concern himself. It was the first thing all morning that made Mason smile, faint and brief, but real. Whatever tension remained between them did not disappear, but something had shifted. A working trust neither of them had planned on finding at an airport gate before 8 in the morning. Charlotte stepped away to call her flight department directly, arranging clearance for an additional passenger and confirming departure timing for the company aircraft. Mason watched her from a short distance, aware that the day had already turned into something far larger than a routine consulting trip. While she was gone, Mason found himself thinking about the review waiting for him and about how easily a single overlooked detail could travel from a testing bench in Colorado to a passenger's boarding pass in Seattle if the right person wanted it to. He had spent enough years around aircraft systems to know that the most dangerous failures were rarely loud ones. They were quiet, patient, and buried beneath paperwork that looked correct until someone bothered to check it twice. When Charlotte returned, her expression had changed again, this time into something closer to alarm. The flight department had just informed her that the company aircraft had received a maintenance hold, issued minutes earlier, from a source no one in the department could immediately identify. 2 obstacles in a single morning could no longer be explained away as coincidence, and both Charlotte and Mason understood that immediately, even before either of them said it aloud. A flagged boarding restriction was one thing. A sudden maintenance hold on a private aircraft, issued the moment Charlotte confirmed she was bringing an outside reviewer along, was something else entirely. Charlotte requested the reasoning behind the hold and received an answer within minutes. Possible hydraulic contamination, the notice read, a phrase serious enough to ground any aircraft without argument. Mason asked to see the maintenance log before anyone accepted the explanation at face value, and Charlotte, without hesitation, arranged for him to review it directly. The aircraft had completed a full inspection the previous evening. Nothing in the records suggested contamination of any kind, hydraulic or otherwise. Mason did not need advanced tools or technical wizardry to notice the problem. He simply compared timestamps. The hold had been entered into the system only after Charlotte messaged her flight department to say she would be bringing an external reviewer with her that morning. Someone inside Hayes Aeronautics was watching her schedule closely enough to react to a single internal message within minutes. That was not paranoia. That was a fact sitting plainly in the data. Charlotte exhaled slowly and said what neither of them had wanted to say outright. Her own company, the one her father had built, might be actively working to keep a safety reviewer away from evidence. She admitted to Mason, quietly and without excuses, that she had suspected something was wrong for nearly 3 months. Inspection reports had been altered in small, easily missed ways. Supplier certifications did not match the paperwork filed alongside them. A quality control engineer she trusted had resigned abruptly with no clear explanation. And through all of it, Logan Pierce had kept pushing shipment schedules forward, insisting delays would cost the company contracts it could not afford to lose. Mason asked the obvious question. Why hadn't she reported any of it yet? Because suspicion isn't evidence, Charlotte said. Then let's get evidence, Mason answered. There was no dramatic declaration in the words, only quiet resolve. The kind that came from a man who had spent his career trusting data over instinct and instinct over convenient explanations. Charlotte nodded, something settling in her posture that had not been there a moment before. While the flight department arranged for an independent inspection to clear the aircraft properly, the two of them found themselves waiting in a small private terminal lounge, away from the noise of the main concourse. There was no luxury in the moment, no performance of wealth or comfort. 2 paper cups of coffee sat between them on a plain table, cooling slowly as the morning stretched on. Charlotte asked, almost carefully, why he had left defense work behind after everything he had accomplished in it. Mason answered simply, "My daughter needed a father who came home." Charlotte did not press further. She did not need to. Something about the way he said it told her everything she needed to understand about the man sitting across from her, a person entirely uninterested in reputation or reward, motivated by something far smaller and far more durable. Her phone rang before either of them spoke again. Colonel Reed. He confirmed that the airport's investigation into the boarding restriction had been formally escalated to the appropriate authorities for review. Then, before ending the call, he added one line that stayed with Mason far longer than the rest of the conversation. "Whatever you're looking into, Mason, don't assume the airport was the real target." Mason understood immediately. The gate had never been the point. It had only ever been a delay tactic, a way to buy time before the real confrontation, the one waiting for him on a test bench in Colorado Springs. The independent inspection cleared the aircraft within the hour, confirming what Mason had already suspected from the maintenance log alone. There had been no contamination, no legitimate mechanical concern of any kind. Charlotte authorized departure immediately, and the flight to Colorado Springs, though later than planned, still landed with enough time before the approval deadline that had been quietly pressuring the entire morning. Inside the testing facility, Mason went straight to the module waiting on the bench, setting aside every distraction from the day behind him. He did not need dramatic equipment or theatrical revelations. He needed careful eyes and a habit of trusting physical evidence over convenient paperwork, a habit that had served him well for 2 decades. The serial number stamped on the housing matched the official records exactly, precise and unremarkable. But when Mason examined the internal thermal shield beneath it, he found a batch code that did not belong to the same production run listed on the component's certification. Someone had swapped the internal shielding after manufacture, quietly, without altering the exterior markings anyone would check first. The picture assembled itself with uncomfortable speed. A subcontracted supplier had produced a batch of thermal shields that failed to meet specification. Rather than absorb the cost of scrapping an entire shipment worth tens of millions of dollars, someone inside Hayes Aeronautics had arranged for falsified certification paperwork, allowing the defective components to move forward into production and eventually onto aircraft already in service. Logan Pierce had signed off on the paperwork chain that made it possible. What Mason still needed was proof that Logan had known about the defect itself, not merely approved routine documentation without reading it closely. Charlotte, working alongside him, pulled the original digital authorization records tied to the shipment and felt her stomach drop. Her own name appeared as the approving signature. But Mason, reviewing the printed metadata attached to the file, noticed the approval timestamp fell during a week Charlotte had been in London for an unrelated business trip, with no digital access to the system in question. Her electronic signature had been used without her knowledge. Logan was not only covering up a defect, he was quietly positioning Charlotte to take the blame if the truth ever surfaced. Charlotte sat with that realization for a long moment, staring at the printed metadata as if reading it again might change what it said. She had trusted Logan for nearly a decade, had defended his judgment to her own board more than once, and had never once considered that the greatest threat to her company might be sitting 2 offices down from her own. Mason did not try to soften the moment for her. He simply waited, letting her arrive at the conclusion on her own terms rather than handing it to her secondhand. Her phone rang again before either of them could fully process what they had found. Logan calling directly this time, his voice carrying the practiced concern of someone confident he had already won. Charlotte did not accuse him. She told him instead that the review had turned up nothing significant, that the modules appeared consistent with prior findings, and that there was no reason for further delay. Mason watched her deliver the lie smoothly, without hesitation, and understood immediately what she was doing. She was not protecting Logan, she was giving him just enough rope to hang himself with his own confidence. Charlotte added, almost as an afterthought, that Mason would return to Seattle the next morning with the single copy of his findings. In truth, the data had already been duplicated and sent securely to an independent legal counsel outside the company entirely, safe from anyone who might want it to disappear. Logan's response came quickly, warm and reassuring on the surface. "Good, make sure Mr. Carter gets home safely." The call ended. Charlotte lowered the phone slowly, and neither she nor Mason said anything for a long moment. The words themselves were ordinary, the kind of thing anyone might say in passing. But given everything the morning had already revealed, they did not sound like a courtesy at all. By the time Mason and Charlotte returned to Seattle, the airport's internal investigation had already traced the origin of the boarding restriction back through several layers of access logs. The flag had not been entered by Logan Pierce directly. Instead, a contractor responsible for maintaining the airport's travel risk software had used another employee's credentials to insert it manually, an action that left a clear digital trail once investigators knew where to look. Payment records connected to that contractor led back to a consulting firm, and the consulting firm in turn held an active contract with the office of the Chief Operating Officer at Hayes Aeronautics. The line from the airport gate to Logan's desk was no longer a matter of suspicion. It was documented. Catherine Blake reached out to Charlotte directly that same afternoon, unprompted, offering a detail she had only just remembered clearly. Moments before Mason arrived at the gate that morning, she had received an internal call instructing her, in plain terms, not to override any restriction attached to a passenger named Carter. Whoever placed that call had known Mason's name and his gate assignment before the restriction even appeared on her screen. The call had been logged automatically, and Catherine agreed without hesitation to provide a formal statement. It was a small but important shift in the story. The woman who had first denied Mason boarding, who had briefly made him the object of a room's quiet suspicion, was now the one helping unravel the truth behind it. Nothing about her had changed. She had only ever followed the system in front of her. The system itself had been the problem. Charlotte called an emergency board meeting for the following morning, and Logan arrived exactly as expected, composed and confident, clearly unaware of how much ground had already shifted beneath him. Mason did not sit beside Charlotte at the table, and he made no attempt to appear as anything other than what he actually was, an outside consultant retained to evaluate a technical failure. He sat across from Logan instead, a plain folder in front of him. Charlotte walked the board through the findings without embellishment. A batch discrepancy in the thermal shielding, altered certification documents, a digital approval signed under her name during a period when she had no access to the system, interference with her external reviewer's travel arrangements, a payment trail connecting an airport contractor to Logan's own office budget. Logan responded the way men in his position often do when cornered, not with panic but with redirection. He suggested that Mason's prior work with the Air Force created an obvious conflict of interest, implying that Mason was protecting old defense contacts by manufacturing doubt about a civilian supplier. It was a reasonable-sounding accusation delivered smoothly, aimed at the one person in the room without a corporate title to defend. Mason did not argue the point. He simply opened the folder and placed the module on the table in front of him. "Then don't trust me," he said. "Trust your own serial numbers." He pointed to the two mismatched production codes stamped directly onto the hardware itself, evidence that required no interpretation and no loyalty to anyone in the room. The silence that followed was total. Charlotte delivered the final piece herself, an email her compliance director had recovered from an archived server backup, one Logan clearly believed had been deleted permanently. In it, Logan had written plainly that if Carter saw the thermal variance, the shipment would die, and that Mason needed to be kept away from the review until Friday. There was no dramatic confession, no raised voices, no denial dramatic enough to survive the words already on the screen. Logan simply understood in that quiet room that everything had already ended. He gathered his things slowly, the practiced composure of a lifetime finally failing him in front of the board he had spent years cultivating. Nobody stopped him from leaving the room. Nobody needed to. The folder on the table and the email on the screen had already said everything that mattered, and no amount of polish could talk either one of them back into silence. Charlotte suspended Logan from his position that same afternoon and turned every piece of evidence over to the company's outside legal counsel and the relevant federal regulators. The defective shipment was halted before a single additional unit left the facility, and the modules already in circulation were recalled for full inspection. Nobody declared Logan guilty of a crime that day, because that determination would belong to investigators and courts, not to a boardroom. But the machinery of accountability had already begun moving, slow and procedural, the way real consequences usually do. A formal criminal and corporate investigation opened within the week. Logan was removed entirely from operational authority while the process continued. Hayes Aeronautics launched an independent safety review, led by engineers with no connection to the original chain of approvals. Several employees who had quietly raised concerns months earlier, only to be dismissed or sidelined, were invited back to give testimony that finally had somewhere to go. Charlotte found Mason outside the headquarters building later that afternoon, the air cooler now, the frantic energy of the past 2 days beginning to settle into something quieter. "My company put your name on a screen like you were dangerous," she said. "Your company didn't," Mason answered. "Someone inside it did, and I was supposed to know what was happening inside my own company," Charlotte said. Mason did not offer her an easy way out of that responsibility, and she did not seem to want one. He only said, simply, "Then fix it." Charlotte nodded, steady now in a way she had not been at the airport gate 2 mornings earlier. "I intend to," she said. It was in that small exchange, more than anything dramatic that had happened before it, that Mason's respect for her settled into something real. Not because of her position or her company's name, or the private aircraft that had carried them to Colorado Springs. Because she had looked directly at a failure that belonged to her, and chosen to own it rather than explain it away. Colonel Jackson Reed met Mason one final time before returning to his own duties, finding him near the terminal where the entire situation had begun. "You still know how to disrupt everyone's schedule," Jackson said, the closest thing to a joke either man allowed themselves that week. "Apparently," Mason answered. Jackson asked almost carefully whether Mason had ever considered returning to work connected to defense programs again, given everything that had just unfolded. Mason declined gently. His life had moved in a different direction years ago, and nothing about the past 2 days had changed the reasons behind that choice. Jackson extended his hand. "Good seeing you again, Carter." There was no crowd watching this time, no salute, no display for anyone's benefit. Just 2 men who had once worked side by side, standing quietly in an airport that had, for one strange morning, become the center of something much larger than either of them expected. Mason watched Jackson walk back toward his own gate, the 2 junior officers falling into step behind him again, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since the moment his boarding pass first turned red. He was not the kind of man who needed applause for doing what the evidence told him to do. He had simply wanted the truth to matter more than convenience, and for one difficult morning it finally had. 3 months passed before Mason found himself back at that same Seattle terminal, and almost nothing about the moment resembled the last time he had stood there. Hayes Aeronautics had rebuilt its quality assurance process from the ground up under Charlotte's direction, with an independent safety committee now reviewing every certification before a single part left the facility. Mason had agreed to stay on as a consultant to that committee, though he had turned down an offer to join the company in an executive role. He preferred to keep his independence, and Charlotte had not pushed him to reconsider. That morning they stood together near the same gate area preparing to fly to Wichita for an aviation safety conference neither of them particularly wanted to attend, but both agreed was necessary. There was no crisis waiting this time. No colonel walking through the terminal. No flagged system quietly working against them. Just two people and a boarding pass. Charlotte glanced at the screen as the agent scanned his ticket. "Any red lights?" she asked. "Not yet," Mason said. She laughed, quiet and easy, the kind of laugh that had taken 3 months of careful, unhurried time to earn. In the weeks since Colorado Springs, they had shared coffee more times than either of them had bothered to count, and dinner twice, though neither had used the word date to describe it out loud. Charlotte had met his daughter exactly once, briefly, over a weekend lunch that stayed comfortably ordinary. There had been no dramatic introduction, no attempt to force a connection that hadn't grown naturally on its own. The relationship, whatever shape it was slowly taking, moved at the pace of two adults who had already seen what happened when people rushed toward convenient conclusions. Before boarding began, Charlotte turned to him with a question she had clearly been holding on to. "When we get back, dinner?" "We've had dinner," Mason said. "I mean the kind where neither of us discusses defective aircraft components," she clarified. Mason considered this for a moment, mock serious. "Sounds risky," he said. "You handled the airport," Charlotte answered. "I think you can handle dinner." He looked at her for a long beat, something settling behind his eyes. "Friday," he said. "Friday," she agreed, smiling as boarding was announced over the intercom. Charlotte stepped ahead of him toward the gate, then paused and glanced back. Mason was standing at the scanner, holding his boarding pass steady, waiting for the small sound that would tell him everything was fine. The screen blinked green. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter," the agent said. Mason looked up at Charlotte, who was watching him with quiet attention. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. They walked down the jet bridge together, unhurried, the noise of the terminal fading slowly behind them. 3 months earlier, a gate in this same airport had closed in front of Mason Carter because someone feared what he might discover. This time it had simply opened, the way gates are supposed to, and Charlotte Hayes walked through it beside him, without hesitation, without needing to look back again. Mason Carter never set out to prove anything that morning. He only wanted to reach a testing bench in Colorado Springs before a defective shipment slipped past the people trusting it to be safe. What stopped him at the gate was never really about him at all. It was someone else's fear of what careful eyes and honest data could uncover. That is often how quiet competence works. It rarely announces itself with confrontation. It simply keeps showing up, keeps checking the numbers, keeps refusing to look away, until the truth becomes impossible to bury. If this story stayed with you, remember that the people who protect us most are rarely the loudest voices in the room. They are the ones who stay steady when everyone else insists they should not.